Hey everyone, we'll start in a minute or so as people are trickling in. I think we got strong attendance, so we can start now. So hello everyone, and welcome to the stakeholder webinar on the release of a brand new Cookstove methodology titled Energy Efficiency and Fuel Switch Measures in Cookstoves, or VM50 in short. It's a pleasure to have you here. In this webinar, we'll discuss the background and describe the key elements, basically, and the provisions of the VM50 methodology, with a special focus on the new and improved approaches and provisions, such as double counting, direct measurement techniques, sums and all, FNRB determination methods, and also the range of methods on other ex ante and ex post parameters that we have specifically included in this methodology compared to the last one. So basically, the objective of organizing this session is to adequately sensitize and increase understanding amongst the stakeholders at large about this new methodology that we have released, basically to increase its acceptance and encourage greater adoption in the market. So that's basically the objective mostly of this webinar. The duration of this webinar is 90 minutes. The first 60 minutes or hour or so will be a presentation on VM50. So it'll be me and Jessica who will be taking you through the methodology itself. And the last 30 minutes will be open to question and answers, where you can then voice your questions and your comments on the methodology, anything related to that. Please feel free to type in your comments and or questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them when we can. You can voice your comments and your questions after the presentation ends, as I just mentioned, and we'll respond to them in real time. Also wanted to mention, before we move on to the meat of the things, is that the link to the webinar recording will be available on our website and the YouTube channel. I think we'll also share the PPT with you guys so you can have a look at your convenience. So with that covered, let me start by introducing the team responsible for developing this methodology, obviously in various capacities, who are also serving as panelists in the session today. I'll start by introducing myself. I am Pranav Sharma, Technical Manager, Industrial Innovation at Verra, and I'll be serving as a moderator today for this session. Along with me, we have my colleagues at Verra, Christian Ehrat, Director, VCM Program Methodologies, and Ian Kohara, Director, Energy and Industrial Innovation. Both of them have been instrumental and involved in the development of this methodology and fulfilled their roles in that. We also have Jessica Wade Murphy from Atmosphere Alternative, who was the lead author of this methodology. And she, along with her team, have helped develop this whole methodology with Verra helping. She will be presenting the technical aspects of this methodology shortly. Next slide, please. So let's move on and briefly discuss what we have lined up for the session today. We will start by providing you an introduction to the methodology and the key developments surrounding it. This will hopefully provide some important background and set the context for the forthcoming discussion that we'll have, that Jessica will facilitate, and then we'll have the Q&A session as I've just mentioned. We will then shift gears where Jessica will take you through the methodology itself and discuss its main components really, which would include scope, applicability, project boundary, additionality, and other approaches that are included in the methodology as a standard. And also the methods for determination of emission reductions, followed by discussion on the key updates compared to the previous version of the methodology, which was VMR6 version 1.2, and also highlight the notable features of VM50, which is something that I'm sure you'll find interesting and want to know more about. This will help provide you an understanding of how the methodology is designed and what are its key provisions, and also the allowed ER pathways that exist within this methodology. We will end the presentation by discussing the process of adopting VM50 within the VCS standard, which is facilitated through a grace period, as is with every methodology that we publish, and a mandatory transition to the methodology by 2027. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll start off with the introduction and motivation. So as you would know, we have recently released a new Cookstove methodology. It's titled Energy Efficiency and Fuel Switch Measures in Cookstoves, VM50. It has taken us more than 2 years to develop it. We started, I think, somewhere in early or mid 2022. We got Atmosphere Alternative involved at that time, and it was a long time to the present. And we had a lot of inputs and discussions with various people and agencies, which has helped develop this methodology. So methodology was released last month, October 9th to be specific, and it's right now ready for use for any new or existing projects there. Atmosphere Alternative, as I mentioned, was the external consultant on this methodology, and they are the ones who led the development after a whole RFP process and an interview process that Verra usually takes with external consultants. So they led the development of VM50, and Verra helped provide technical inputs, carbon standard related inputs, as well as review the methodology itself. So we think this methodology, based on how in tune it is with the latest scientific understanding and the best practices in the industry, that it is a comprehensive and robust new methodology on cookstoves. Also based on the fact that it provides a range of approaches from the conservative default values to the more accurate, high achieving and high bar requirement approaches like sums and KPTs, which require a lot of effort, as I'm sure you know. So this methodology basically quantifies emission reductions from one, energy efficiency, and second, fuel switch measures in cookstoves. Jessica will take you through the provisions of how that is done in this methodology later on. We also think and hope that this methodology, if it's widely adopted by the stakeholders and the industry at large, based on what I've just mentioned, will further strengthen the credibility and the integrity of the cookstove sector in voluntary carbon market especially, and also the resulting emission reductions from the projects that use this methodology. That is, I think, quite important from that point of view, this methodology, and also to provide a trust and strengthen the credibility around cookstove sector in the market, which is the need of the hour, frankly. So I think this methodology, and we firmly believe, at least at Verra, that's when methodologies will help promote that. Verra has also, seeing the confidence that we have in this methodology, we have also submitted the methodology for assessment under ICVCM CCP, co-carbon principle labeling, and we intend to get the approval, and we are hopeful that it will be approved pretty soon by the ICVCM. We have been in long discussions with them and trying to clarify their questions and concerns on the range of options and provisions in this methodology. So that's happening parallelly. And also it's worth mentioning that Verra is planning to review the final cut that's submitted to us for the clear methodology, which is being developed by the CCA/4C. And we are looking to review that methodology. We're excited about it and want to see if there are any alignment opportunities with it once it's released. So that's up for the future. Finally, Verra is committed to collaborating with other stakeholders. As I've mentioned, we have been in touch with a variety of stakeholders in the development of VM50. We will continue to be on that path of collaborating with various stakeholders in this space in an effort to strengthen the integrity and robustness around methodologies and practices and standards in the cookstove sector, which obviously would mean aligning with the best practices, scientific rigor, and approaches, and include those best practices and approaches in this methodology going forward. So this methodology is by no means the final word. is the best word in the market right now, but it's not the final word. We will keep updating and improving it as and when we need to do so. Next slide, please. Thank you. What I also wanted to mention is what motivated us, what prompted us to develop this methodology. And I think it's from a background and context point of view, it's quite important to lay this out. So there are 5 reasons that we think are the top 5 motivating factors for development of this methodology. There might be other factors, but they haven't made the list. Number 1 would be addressing the criticism around the overestimations in existing Cookstove methodologies. There were a few publications and media houses that have, I think, a few months ago or a year ago, that had levied criticism against existing Cookstove project standards and methodologies. So those criticisms, we think, have been addressed sufficiently in this methodology based on our discussions and research and analysis and understanding of those issues and how we can solve them. Second is we also wanted to align this methodology with the latest and robust scientific understanding, best practices, and the recent developments in the Cookstove sector. For example, FNRB values, default FNRB values from the UNFCCC, digitized and direct measurement approaches like sums, stuff like that. That is, I think, will bring trust and confidence in the Cookstove sector. That's much needed. We also want to align with the ICVCM for securing CCB labeling. That's quite important and gives a signal and enhances the integrity, at least of this methodology and how it's seen by the market and it's good from an optics point of view, we think. And also quite important is, as you might know, quite a lot of methodologies approved under the VCS program are from the CDM. We'd like to decrease our dependence on the CDM, considering there's an uncertainty what will happen with most of their methodologies. We know that their current stock of Cookstove methodologies will be revised under Article 6.4, but that it's not certain what will happen to the other methodologies. Just to become self-reliant and have our own crop of methodologies going forward, I think it's important to be self-reliant and decrease dependence on CDM methodologies. And this methodology is an effort to do so. Last but not least, we also wanted to make some general clarifications and editorial improvements around a few areas in the methodologies that I think will help enhance the quality and readability of the methodology going forward. And we are obviously open to having discussions about making it better going forward. So next slide, please.
Hey, Pranav, I see someone in the chat has their hand up. Did you want to just clarify that we'll be dealing with questions at the end and that they can submit the questions in the chat?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. So yeah, happy to deal with your questions in the chat. Please feel free to write them, as I mentioned, and we'll deal with your questions in the Q&A session after the presentation. So please feel free to use the chat for that purpose. So next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll now move on to the meat of discussion, which is talking about the methodology contents and methods. And I hand it over to Jessica to take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Pranav, and thanks to everyone for joining today. I'm delighted to see that there is so much interest in this new methodology, which indeed has been a long time coming. Pranav already gave the context, but I would add, I mean, I'm sure many of you have been paying close attention to this sector over the past couple of years and know that it's kind of been a moving target. There's been a lot happening in terms of new research, new knowledge, new tools, etc. And so we have been closely following those, learning about those and incorporating those elements in this methodology to the full extent possible, while at the same time recognizing that it's not the end of the story. Further developments will happen. And so that's why, as Pranav mentioned, methodology also keeps the door open for further improvements as the science advances even more. So that's wanted to make a extra emphasis on that point as we go into the presentation of the contents. So when we look at VM50 and what the scope of this methodology is, it is focused primarily on cooking. So it's focused primarily on household cooking, although it does also cover cooking in communities and institutions and SMEs. And it's written primarily around household and small institutional cooking, since that's also the majority of the real projects so far in the market. And this methodology covers replacement of cooking on non-renewable biomass. So it includes switching to more efficient project devices using non-renewable biomass or mix of renewable and non-renewable biomass, and also switch to new stoves and new fuel types, such as renewable biomass fuels, bioethanol, also LPG or electric-powered project devices. It also covers the replacement of solid or liquid fossil fuel cookstoves. And in this case, in terms of solid or liquid fossil fuels, here it's actually required to go to a different improved fuel type. So there's no allowance for, let's say, improved solid fuel cooking. And so this expands on what was available under VMR. The original methodology under VCS. And I think we can go to the next one now. I wanted to highlight some important applicability conditions, not all of them, but some that are relevant to some of the expanded scope. So one of the areas that's specifically allowed under this methodology is the use of renewable biomass. That includes both, let's say, unprocessed renewable biomass or renewable biomass that's just undergone mechanical processing, and also renewable charcoal. So that would be charcoal that comes from renewable sources and is produced in an efficient way. And so when renewable biomass is used, we have some requirements related to ensuring that there's not leakage due to the sourcing of that renewable biomass. So for example, it can be from residues, for example, from agriculture or production processes. And it could also be from renewable charcoal. And so in those cases, again, there are some conditions to ensure that there won't be leakage due to land use displacement or something due to the production of that renewable biomass. In terms of cookstove characteristics, I wanted to mention that in the case of project stoves that use LPG, this is of course a fossil fuel. So in the context of kind of just transition and also avoiding lock-in of emissions intensive technologies, there are some specific conditions when the project's cookstove uses LPG, recognizing that it can be an important transition fuel in some markets. So it's not excluded from the methodology, but there are some restrictions on how long LPG cookstoves can be credited. Yeah. Seeking to drive that energy transition and avoid lock-in. And in terms of electricity or stoves that use electric powered stoves, there are a variety of options for the electricity sources that can be used to power those stoves. So those can include decentralized renewable energy systems, so mini grids, also like household level renewable energy, which we call self-generated in this context, or the electricity can also come from national or regional electric grids. So electricity is also considered an eligible fuel in its many different forms, coming in. Although if the electricity will be, let's say, put in place, if the renewable electricity source will be put in place as part of the project, then the conditions seek that is primarily renewable electricity, so that the methodology isn't driving, let's say, the deployment of, diesel power generators or similar. Yeah. And next, please. Looking further at some of the specific applicability conditions, conditions have been added that seek to avoid harm and that seek to avoid double counting. So one applicability condition that seeks to avoid harm is that related to compliance with the let's say, local regulatory context. So it's important that any project is compliant with national, subnational, or local regulations or guidance related to cooking and fuel supply for households or for the target population. So we want to ensure that projects are always aligned with any regulatory framework that's providing requirements on let's say how good cooking needs to be, or how effective cooking devices need to be in a project area. In terms of avoiding double counting, the methodology includes a pretty normal condition, which is that devices must include a unique product identification to avoid double counting with other mitigation actions, with other cooking mitigation actions. So that is common with other projects or in other methodologies. But this methodology has also included a new applicability condition, which seeks to avoid double counting, which is a check that, or whether there are red projects whose boundary overlaps with the expected fuel source area of the project. And so right now, this is being included as more of an informational item, but projects are being required to report on this, or to identify, explore, identify, and report on this issue, whether this overlap is taking place. So that is seeking to ensure in the future that there is really good information about how much of an issue this is, to what an extent this is an issue, so that if it's found that this could be a potential important source of double counting, this could be addressed in a future version of the methodology. Next, please. And I wanted to run quickly through project boundary. I think this should also look pretty familiar. I don't think we've done anything drastically new in the project boundary section, but it would be important to note that in terms of the thermal energy generation, the baseline emissions, or including emissions from CO2, and also any emissions from methane or N2O, which is associated with fuel use. And then if a project were to use renewable charcoal that substitutes non-renewable charcoal in the baseline, then the production emissions from that charcoal can also be included in the baseline emissions. So that's a relevant point for charcoal. And then here, we just I'd like to repeat again that for the non-renewable biomass fuels, to understand better where these fuels are coming from, and also as part of that check with the red potential double counting, project proponents must provide a KML file that delimits the geographic areas where that biomass fuel is coming in the project, and a description of how that area is defined. So we're seeking to have better understanding of where biomass fuels that are being used in a mitigation project are actually being sourced from. So that's another kind of new development in this methodology. Next, please. In terms of the baseline scenario, the baseline scenario is defined based on the components and the makeup of the baseline scenario, as well as the greenhouse gas emission sources that are relevant to the baseline scenario. And so the baseline scenario is defined using a baseline survey, which is also something that is common with many other methodologies in the sector. And it does follow a stepwise process that includes identifying alternative baseline scenarios, and then doing a regulatory check on those, consider existing and forthcoming government policies and legal requirements, and ensuring that the baseline scenarios are aligned with those requirements and not simply fulfilling requirements. And then we have another step, which to assess financial, institutional, and information barriers to determine which is the most likely baseline scenario. And the scenario that comes out of that must be either the continued use of non-renewable biomass, right? Either biomass, firewood, or charcoal, or the use of the fossil fuels that I mentioned in the applicability section, or the scope section, which could be coal or kerosene, for example. Next, please. So the specific, let's say the specificity of the baseline scenario is defined using the baseline survey. And again, the baseline survey will define elements like the baseline fuel types and the extent of their use, so the proportion of their use by the target population. And so the methodology uses language. It's very conscious that there may be, in fact, that there may likely be multiple baseline fuel types in use. The baseline survey must also define the source of the baseline fuels. For example, whether they are collected, if they're purchased, if they're procured some other way, and also seek to understand, in the case that those are biomass fuels, the actual, approximate locations where those come from. The baseline survey also seeks to determine what the baseline technologies are that are used for cooking. And again, with the language and the methodology clearly showing that there may be multiple technologies and that baselines would need to capture that case where there are multiple baseline technologies that are clearly being used by the population, and then also average household size. So this is just a parameter that's needed for the equations in the methodology, but this can also be captured in that same survey. And this survey needs to be validated against other information, let's say third-party information, such as literature, publications, government statistics, or NGO publications, to make sure that it's realistic. And the initial baseline survey is performed prior to validation, and it determines these relevant components of the baseline. And then there is also language which states that which encourages the project proponent to employ third-party agencies to carry out the baseline survey. So utilizing, the services of a disinterested third party to undertake the baseline survey. And then the methodology also has a provision for follow-up baseline surveys to be conducted every 2 years in control households to check that the conditions that were found in the baseline survey continue to be similar. And so the outcomes of the follow-up surveys will be checked using statistical tests to ensure that they're not significantly different from the conditions prior to starting the project. Next, please. In terms of additionality, the additionality, the positive list from the from VMR6 has been maintained, but since the methodology applies to quite a variety of projects now, I think it will be more limited, the number of projects that can use the positive list or that will be eligible. But the additionality now includes a regulatory surplus check in line with the VCS rules. Then the positive list is still available for projects that install or distribute Cookstoves at zero cost and have no other revenue sources. For example, do not have revenue from fuel sales or so forth. And then finally, there is a project method available for all other projects, and these ones will apply the new VCS tool for demonstrating additionality. And so that can use a barrier analysis or an investment analysis, and also involves a common practice check. So that's an invitation also to check out the new VCS additionality tool if you have not done so recently. Next, please. So now we get into the quantification methods for emission reductions under VM50. And here I'd like to give an overview of the kind of path through the equations that are included in the methodology. So the methodology separately calculates baseline and project emissions to provide for transparency. And it calculates baseline emissions based on measurements of the baseline using kitchen performance tests, or there's also default values available. Next, or then the methodology, also calculates project emissions from cooking using project-based measurements. We'll get into that more. But there are different methods available for measuring fuel use during the project. The methodology includes a cross-check of the baseline for accuracy and conservativeness, which takes into account actual project cooking and some proxies to determine how the project cooking compares to what was observed in the baseline. The methodology then calculates other sources of project emissions if there are new types of actions that take place to support the project that could generate emissions, then those are captured in the other project emissions. And finally, it estimates leakage. And then all of that comes together to calculate emission reductions. So this is an overview of the steps the methodology includes to calculate emission reductions. So now we can go into the detail of what this looks like. So in terms of the baseline emissions, so we take the energy use from the actual measured baseline, which is from a kitchen performance test, a KPT measurement campaign to capture the baseline cooking practices. And this obviously needs to fulfill statistical requirements that are captured in the CDM standard. So there's a place that we're still referring to the CDM standard, but that's the requirement for the statistical requirements related to the results of the KPT measurement campaign need to be in fulfillment of the requirements that are expressed in the methodology. And then it also takes into account the commissioned project devices, and a usage rate, so a proportion of project devices that are still operating in the year. And then obviously emission factors for all of the fuels that are involved there in the baseline cooking, both CO2 and non-CO2 emission factors. And for fuel wood and charcoal, the FNRB is considered in this calculation. Next, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the energy use of the baseline is taken from a measurement campaign, from measuring the actual energy use in kitchens in the target population using the KPT protocol. And obviously the results need to be scaled to get an annual value for each fuel type that's in use in the baseline. An alternative is to use the default values, where we have a default value of 0.5 tons per capita per year of air-dried wood for firewood, and a default of 0.13 tons per person per year for charcoal. And naturally, these default values are available to be used when the baseline survey has indicated that the target population is using, only this fuel as its cooking fuel. So again, two alternatives: either a measurement using ex ante KPT measurement campaign, or default values. Next, please. Later, we also have another alternative for, or let's say the baseline is defined in a slightly different way when the project devices are powered by electricity and they have special characteristics that affect energy consumption. So this is particularly pertains to electric pressure cookers. And in this case, the baseline energy use is back calculated using controlled cooking tests that seek to capture the baseline cooking practices that can feasibly be replaced with the electric pressure cooker, since the assumption is that not all baseline cooking tasks could be replaced by the project device. And so this alternative method applies in that specific case and seeks to ensure that there's, let's say, accuracy and also conservatism in how the baseline emissions are calculated in this case. And I think I would invite you to enter the methodology and check all the detail on this if the specific case is of interest to you. Next, please. So in the project emissions section, we have as I mentioned, project emissions from the cooking, from the energy use in the kitchens. And then we have other sources of project emissions. In terms of energy use, the equation is set up quite similarly to how it is in the baseline. Although in this case, since project fuel use will always be measured in some way, we have included the fuel amount directly into this equation as a difference to the baseline emissions equation. But it's otherwise quite similar. And can we go to the next slide, please? And in terms of the methods for determining the fuel use in project devices, so here you're seeing the parameter name for project fuel use. So there are 3 different approaches available for determining this value. So one is also based on KPT measurement campaigns, and these can take place every year or every 2 years at the lowest frequency. And again, these need to be carried out in a statistically sound manner for measuring all of the fuel use that's taking place in the project kitchens using both the project device and any devices that are operating in parallel with the project device. Another option is to use direct measurement of the fuel or energy use or electricity use of the project cooking device. And so direct measurement may be undertaken on a selection of devices or all devices and for the ambitious. And these measurements also, of course, when they're undertaken on a sample of devices, then they also need to be statistically sound and achieving a confidence precision of 90-10 for the average value. And the direct measurement will be focused on the project devices. A third option is also effectively a direct measurement option, and this is related to fuel purchase monitoring. This is being restricted right now to project devices using fossil fuels, which means LPG or bioethanol, since these are considered to be fuels where the fuel use could be, let's say, controlled such that the fuel that is sold is being used exclusively for the project cooking. And so in the case of these types of fuels, there could be continuous records of fuel purchases to ensure that the correct amount of total fuel being used in the project is captured and used for calculations. Next, please. When the devices use electricity, when project devices use electricity, then there's a slightly different equation which is used to capture the energy used during the project. So in this case, the measurement of the energy use can also be done using a kitchen performance test. And so that would be quite similar to the requirement for any other fuel type. The other option is to use direct measurement by metering, and this may be done on all devices or on a sample, again, in a statistically sound manner. And in this case, transmission and distribution losses are also taken into account in the total amount of energy to ensure that the project emissions are not being underestimated. Next, please. So one component that's included in this methodology is also a cross-check on the baseline energy use to address stove stacking. And so this seeks to address stove stacking by focusing on the actual use of the project stove and the replacement of baseline cooking that's being achieved by the project stove. And so the equations and the estimations really focus in on the project device and the difference that it's making in household cooking and in household cooking emissions. And so one way that this is ensured is by including this cross-check. So what this cross-check does is it uses a proxy to check that the amount of energy that's being used for cooking in the project is similar to the amount of energy that was being used for cooking in the baseline. And if it's not, if the project Cookstove is being used to, let's say, a lesser extent, or is, clearly not equivalent to the total amount of cooking that was taking place prior to the project, then baseline emissions can only be calculated for the proportion of cooking that can be assumed to be replaced by the project Cookstove. And so again, this uses this proxy, which is based on the measured energy use of the project stove and the ratio of the stove efficiencies to make that proxy value of how much, let's say, equivalent energy would have been used in the baseline to provide the same cooking service that's provided by the project stove. So this is an important cross-check. The cross-check must be undertaken for all of the project descriptions, yeah. However, in the case that the project device is an electric device, there are some special considerations in that case, since electric devices can sometimes, let's say, have benefits or like improve energy use in a way that's not captured by efficiency ratios. So that is also addressed with some special conditions for that type of project device. Okay, next, please. So we also take into account project emissions from some other sources, such as transportation, fuel production, fugitive emissions related to charcoal production and backup generators. So each of these would apply in a specific case where some new fuel some new fuel use or some new emission source would be present because of the type of project technology or type of project fuel that's put in place. And we've also included the requirement that when let's say when the baseline and project emissions related to these sources could be assumed to be higher in the baseline, then as long as that can be demonstrated, then these could be ignored during the project. So that's included in the project boundary section. But in general, we're seeking to capture all of the potential impacts that a project may have on emission sources to be conservative. Yeah. Next, please. So with respect to leakage emissions, we mention, let's say, 3 main potential sources of leakage emissions. One is due to when the project focuses on reducing or avoiding the use of non-renewable biomass, there is some potential that this biomass could be reused outside the project boundaries by other users. And there are also other potential types of GHG reversals that could be a concern in this case. We did a review of scientific literature and other publications related to these issues and found that there were mixed results on how important this was. And so for that reason, this has been addressed by including an adjustment factor of 0.95 on emission reductions from projects that reduce or avoid the use of non-renewable biomass. So these potential sources of leakage, which includes other types of GHG reversals, are being addressed through that adjustment factor. When we have projects that decrease the use of a fossil fuel in the baseline, then a potential leakage source might be increased emissions from that saved fossil fuel use by non-project participants. And in this case, again, there was not, let's say, a clear signal in literature that we reviewed about, let's say, the importance or, a consistent impact related to this source. And so in this case, also an adjustment factor of 0.95% is applied to address this potential source of leakage. And our view is that these adjustment factors are likely to assess these potential sources of leakage in a conservative way. Now, if we look at the use of renewable biomass, in this case, if a new renewable biomass source is included in the project as the energy source for project cooking, then there needs to be a check that there's not any shift of pre-project activities or diversion of biomass residues related to this use of biomass. And if there is, then those leakage emissions must be quantified. And that quantification does refer to the CDM tool 16. So these are the three main types of potential leakage emissions that were identified and how they've been addressed in the methodology. Next, please. So if we look at monitoring, I just wanted to highlight a couple especially relevant components of monitoring. So when we look at the kind of usage rate or the percentage of project devices that are still being used, first of all, I would like to point out that for projects that monitor or measure the energy use of all project cookstoves, then this isn't required at all. There doesn't need to be any parallel monitoring of usage because it's captured by the direct measurement. So that is one thing to point out. And then for other projects that do project emissions accounting based on some type of sampling. In this case, there are two options for determining the stoves that continue to be in use. One of those is by applying stove use monitors on a sample of project stoves, again, and just in a statistically sound way, and to confirm that stoves are used frequently and that they're functional. The alternative is to use surveys, which also, of course, must be defined in a designed in a statistically sound way, and then include both an interview with the primary cook and a kitchen observation that includes visual and physical checks of the stove to ensure that this is consistent with the interview, with the verbally stated information. Next, please. In terms of the way that FNRB is defined in this methodology, we have included three options. And so I think two of the options are well known. Option 3 is to use, this is actually a CDM tool 33 default value of 30%. And so that's the default value that has existed in the CDM space since, I think, 2017. Another option for now is to use the CDM tool 30 procedure with a 26% discount, which was also available under VMR 6 version 1.2. And then there is a third option to use default values that have been approved by UNFCCC. So as I'm sure you all know, the MOFOS values that have been under development by the CDM have not yet been approved by the CDM EB at the time of publishing of this methodology. So while we are watching that space very closely and are interested in being able to apply these values in the context of this methodology, at this point, there's not, let's say, an approved outcome from UNFCCC. So project proponents may use the most recent available draft FNRB and must apply the updated approved values once UNFCCC has approved those. And I think here a procedural exception is going to be made such that if a project switches from a draft FNRB to an approved default FNRB, and then no deviation will need to be applied. That will be kind of a smooth update that can be made during a verification cycle. And so this is kind of a compromise way to move toward the MOFAS-based values, while also recognizing that we don't have a, let's say, final approved or UN approved set of default values at this time. Okay, next, please. So now I'd like to highlight some of the key updates and standout features of VM50, especially as compared to previous versions of cooking methodologies available under Verra VCS. Next, please. Okay, so VM50 is seeking to kind of signpost a pathway to better and lower emissions technology for household cooking in the future, and especially in low-income households that tend to host these project types. So some minimum project stove efficiency requirements have been included that seek to be somewhat ambitious. So there's a 25% minimum for biomass-fired stoves, so the 30% minimum for liquid fuels-fired stoves, and for electric stoves, depending on the stove type, it's 40 or 70%. The methodology is also seeking to contribute to energy transition, maybe just energy transition, and avoiding lock-in. And in that sense, while again, LPG is recognized as being a transition fuel in some markets, it can only be credited as a project fuel through 2045, and metering is required for this fuel. So it needs to be, its use needs to be measured when this is a project fuel. And this includes both of the options for direct metering or based on fuel sales. Another stipulation that's included in the methodology, which is seeking to have kind of this continuous improvement, is that at the end of useful life of project devices, to be able to continue crediting, those need to be replaced with comparable or better performing devices for the following crediting periods, or to continue crediting really from these devices. Okay. Next, please. Another step forward with this methodology is related to avoiding double counting and improving understanding of the overlaps between biomass efficiency projects and RED activities. So one of those requirements, as I mentioned earlier, is reporting on the coexistence of biomass efficiency projects with RED activities, or sorry, this would also be replacement projects. I mean, sorry, if biomass is no more used under the project because it's been replaced for another fuel. So this is, we're seeking to improve the understanding of how much of an issue it may be for biomass savings from cooking projects to overlap with reduced deforestation and degradation in RED activities. And related to this, also the requirement to include let's say, spatial analysis of the origin of non-renewable biomass fuel. So seeking to hone in more on where biomass fuels come from and have a better understanding of that, so that we can, again, understand better if there is also, for example, overlap between biomass source areas across projects. And if things like that are a case, then in the future, seek to improve even further efforts to avoid double counting due to overlapping biomass use and savings. Okay. Next, please. With respect to additionality, the additionality requirements are certainly fleshed out as compared to in some other cooking methodologies and in VMR 6. And these are aligned with the ICVCM, or they seek to align certainly with the ICVCM requirements related to additionality, given the target that Verra has to have this methodology approved as a CCP methodology. And we also are requiring a regulatory surplus check. So not only do projects need to be legal, completely fulfilling regulatory, or let's say legal requirements, but also need to go above and beyond what is being kind of required or incentivized by the national, subnational, or local regulatory context. Yeah. Next, please. In terms of emission reductions, so as I mentioned earlier, there is a requirement to keep an eye on what is happening in the background to fuel and cooking technology use and in the project area to determine that the baseline remains significantly similar over the crediting period. And there would need to be a remeasurement of the baseline if the background conditions are found to change significantly. So if there was a significant uptake in a new stove type that was observed over the crediting period, that would need to be addressed. And also, emission reductions are calculated only for the baseline cooking that's replaced by the project activity. So the sidesteps concerns about stove stacking, where potentially the baseline may be calculated over the baseline may be calculated, maybe overestimated if this isn't addressed as it has been in the methodology. While at the same time, the methodology will require data collection on other stoves in use when the KPT option is used. And as an informational exercise, that data will also need to be reported, and it will inform future versions of the methodology. And so again, this is an area where information will be collected and potentially in the future could be used to continue improving the methodology if there's found to be potentially emissions that are not being considered adequately related to parallel stove use in the project setting. Next, please. In terms of the choice of FNRB, so the methodology is setting a precedent for applying locus values. Once these are approved by the CDMEB or some other relevant UNFCCC body, then there will be even more, even increased confidence in using those values. But it already signposts for the confidence that has been expressed, I think, in the market and among users for these MOFUS values that are based on kind of the most recent scientific thinking about non-renewable biomass and what that means. Yeah. Okay. Next, please. And in terms of monitoring, so the methodology includes several options for, let's say, digital and direct monitoring, and also encouragements to apply these methods. So for example, in terms of usage measurement, the alternative to use sums is clearly provided. And when survey-based values are used, then the value must be used at the lower end of the 90% confidence interval. So this is seeking to encourage projects to deploy stove use monitors. In terms of so alternatives are provided for measuring project energy use or fuel purchase directly, either 100% or sample-based. So seeking to have more direct measurements of fuel use as possible, rather than relying on the KPT campaigns, although as I mentioned, those are also certainly included in the methodology at this point, since they are especially important for biomass fuels. And then when KPTs are used, I wanted to mention that the methodology includes options to adjust the standard KPT protocol to incorporate digital monitoring systems. These are described in an appendix to the methodology. And so the expectation, or what this allows for, is rather than being tied to the exact provisions of the standard KPT protocol, let's say newer technologies such as digital scales and other provisions may be included in those KPTs to just to allow for newer technologies, more ease in undertaking KPTs and so forth. Next, please. And with that, I hand it over to Pranav to address grace period and transition before I think we go into a Q&A session. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So next slide, please. So here we wanted to basically discuss how this methodology will be taken up and essentially applied to new and existing projects. And the way we do it, and it's a standard practice, is through grace periods and offering a mandatory transition in this case. So in terms of grace period, as we know, VM50 is eligible for immediate use. Any new projects can use it. Even existing projects can use it in the next verification if they choose to. This methodology replaces version 1.2 of VMR6, which was our erstwhile Cookstove methodology, as well as VMR11 for SD Vista. Both of these methodologies are being inactivated. New projects and projects that are going to renew the grading period are required to complete validation before 31st May. So projects under validation 1st of May 2025. Any new projects that come in will have to use VM50 methodology. So the grace period is as a standard practice is only applicable to projects under validation from when the methodology was published. And this is the amount of time that we are giving projects to complete validation. And these methodologies would be VMR6 version 1.2 and VMR11 version 1. So that's the grace period editorially required to use VM50 starting from 2027 vintage year at the latest. So projects switching to VM50 must use a project description deviation provision in our VCS standard. I think it's mentioned in section 3.2. I've been answering a few questions about it. So they'll have to update the project description, and that needs to be validated and submitted along with the next verification. So like any other PDA description deviation, and also the monitoring reports for that particular year, because it's a verification as well. Such submissions can be made to a period up to 5 years after the last verification. So I guess the 5 years worth of monitoring can happen along with this transition, which happens in 2027. Also wanted to mention that we have a new provision out, which we are basically calling the requantification provision. So registered projects that have registered under any version of AMS2G 1E, VMR6 or VMR11 can in effect update their past verification periods and requantify using this methodology, VM50. We have published, it's not forthcoming as it says in the PPT, it's published this particular procedure, which is a methodology change and requantification procedure. So projects can use this particular document, which is available on our website, and use the current methodology to and requantify their projects accordingly and their credits. And they can then keep using this to the extent that they want, as it's available right now. So I just wanted to flag that. I think that's important thing to mention here as well. So with that, I think we'll end the presentation. We are 4 minutes over time. So let's just end the presentation right now and open the floor for any Q&As. Thank you.
So Pranav, I think we'll just have to select questions from the list that's been submitted in the chat.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, thanks, Ian. There's one question, I guess, that's being repeated is about this baseline reassessment requirement for 2 years. And there have been a lot of questions about it, a lot of pushback as well. So Jessica, would you mind taking at least the first question from Edwin? It talks about the requirement to do every baseline reassessment every 2 years. And you're also talking about how this will be monitored and it's being morally wrong and all of that. So can you please take that question? And there's, well, I guess we'll be responding to all the other questions based on the baseline reassessment.
Sure, Pranav. Yes, so with respect to the parallel monitoring of kind of background conditions, as mentioned, this is being included as a follow-up baseline survey on the control population, which is defined, let's say, ahead of time as using like comparing the outcome of the baseline survey, determining a group of households that can serve as the control, and that are expected to reflect the same conditions as the households that will take part in the activity. And this is included with a follow-up baseline survey every 2 years, which is, again, an interview, right? This doesn't involve direct measurements, but it's an interview with these control households to determine that their conditions continue to be sufficiently similar to what they were before the project was put in place. And so this is being included because, especially in some, let's say, urban and peri-urban situations, but also in some cases, for example, of, let's say, grid expansion, or where there are commercial activities that are driving the provision of new fuel types in geographical areas, there may be changing conditions in terms of fuel use that are happening in parallel with the project activity. And so seeking to avoid overestimating emission reductions due to the project activity when there are background conditions that are also changing toward cleaner or more efficient cooking. This has been included as a provision to address that concern. And so again, it's based on a baseline survey. So it's based on an interview, follow-up interviews, not directly a measurement requirement. And this will be pertinent to avoid overestimating emission reductions in case that there are background conditions that are reflecting improvements in cooking and fuel availability. And I think, I mean, if we look at some locations over the past, 10 years, there are some locations where, where clean cooking is relevant, where there have been improvements in cooking types or cooking technologies and fuels. So I think that this is seeking to address concerns that may stem from those background changes.
Thanks, Jessica. So I guess we can move on to the next question. So this question is from Ashutosh Tiwari. The second question, given that non-renewable biomass like wood is often sourced locally from nearby trees and forests, how will project proponents define and delineate this area as the biomass source? Jessica, you want to take that?
Yeah, happily. So indeed, if the biomass source area is an area that is reached by foot by project, by, let's say, by households that are participating in the project, then that will define how that geographical area is set. So for example, the project can consider what the procurement means are for the project fuels. And if it is collection, then the project can define some assumptions based on what that collection looks like and define the geographical limits of that using those assumptions. I hope that's clear. And again, this is seeking to improve our information about where biomass fuels are coming from. And so again, it's going to be different when those are sourced versus by the households themselves via collection, or where those are purchased, let's say commercially, or but this is just seeking to have projects consider the geographic sourcing area of the fuels and provide information about that will inform going forward and provide more information for making potentially future revisions or future improvements related to accounting. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. We'll move on to the next question, and this is from Camilla. And she's asking, in which way the VM50 addresses overestimation, which parameters are affected as part of FNRB, considering the uncertain discount factor 0.6. So I'm not sure what she's actually asking, but maybe Jessica, if you can broadly discuss the areas of overestimation that this methodology addresses and what the FNRB provisions are broadly, I think that'll be helpful here.
Okay, so I'm going to speak to FNRB first and then other potential sources of overestimation. So there have been some concerns related to FNRB as defined using the CDM tool 30, and that may lead to overestimation by overestimating the percentage of biomass that is not regrowing. So to address that concern, this methodology includes 3 provisions. The first is to use the CDM default value of 30%, which may be considered the global average FNRB. And so that would be one alternative that should prevent overestimation as compared to the values that come straight out of that tool 30. Another way that this is included or that this is addressed is by allowing the tool 30 values to be included, to be used only with the 26% uncertainty deduction. So the tool 30 values would have to apply that uncertainty deduction, which to some extent will address a concern that values determined from that tool may be overestimated. And then the third way that this addresses the concern of overestimating FNRB is to allow the provisional use of MOFA's default values that are in the process of consideration under UNFCCC, so currently in the CDM context, and then signposting that once those values are available, then they, once UNFCCC has approved MOFA's related or whichever values come out of that system, default values for countries, then those would be acceptable under VM50. So those are the specific ways that VM50 seeks to address potential overestimation from FNRB values. With respect to other potential sources of overestimation, one potential source of overestimation that has been a concern is overestimating baseline fuel use. And so that is controlled by using either conservative default values or using values that are measured using KPT campaigns that are statistically sound. And as those KPTs also hopefully incorporate more digital monitoring, the results are expected to be robust and be able to represent true baseline cooking. And also the values that are measured in the baseline will be cross-checked to ensure that they are not an overestimate, or that overestimates are not used to, let's say if there's any overestimation in the baseline, that's not used to define the baseline emissions level against which emission reductions are calculated. And another concern for overestimation has been kind of that there may be, let's say, overestimation of the extent to which project cooking is actually replacing baseline cooking. And so in this methodology, that is controlled both by including direct monitoring or fuel measurement methods for the project cooking, and also including frequent, as an alternative, frequent KPTs, and which would be, again, with a solid statistical design as a way of determining the project fuel use, and again, using a cross-check to ensure that only baseline cooking that is truly replaced by project cooking will be used to determine emission reductions. So that's another way that's being addressed, or that overestimation is being avoided. Another way is related to how the issue of stove stacking is addressed. So stove stacking can lead to overestimation in the case that there are, let's say, significant emissions that are not being taken into account in the baseline, or sorry, significant emissions in the project that are not being included or not being kind of addressed by the assumptions of the calculation. And so in our case, for example, if it's assumed that the project stove is providing all of baseline, is replacing all of the baseline stove use, but in fact, it's not the project stove. In fact, it's, you know, other stoves that are in use in parallel. But those are not taken into account in the accounting. And so in this case, the stove stacking is addressed by excluding, let's say, baseline emissions that would be related, that would actually in the project be kind of continue to be or let's say excluding baseline cooking, sorry, I can explain that better. Excluding baseline cooking from the emissions calculation that in the baseline and the project actually continues to be provided by those same stoves. Yeah. So focusing the emission reductions calculations only on the actual use of the project stove and what that is replacing in terms of baseline cooking. And at the same time, requiring projects to report on that parallel cooking, which they will get from their project KPTs, so that that can be an information item that VCS is using to learn more about how much of that may be a concern and whether that needs to be addressed in a future version of the methodology in a different way. And then some other areas that have been signaled as of interest, for example, for overestimation, have been Hawthorne effect related. But again, we looked at the literature and found that there wasn't a consistent signal from that. It doesn't always lead to overestimation, for example. And another one is related to leakage or potential reversals, non-permanence issues. And so those have been considered here and included as part of the leakage provisions. So with that, I close on that topic. Thanks, Karna.
Thanks, Jessica. So I guess we can move on to the next one. So I think I can take this one. There have been a lot of questions about whether projects can be implemented in Brazil, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and stuff like that. I think it's important to mention that this methodology is applicable globally and to projects in any country, basically, that follows the requirement of the methodology, especially the applicability scope and baseline requirements. So I think just to answer maybe Tendai's question, he's asked about Zimbabwe, and I think this methodology is applicable there as well. So just wanted to clarify that. So moving on to the next one. So we have a question from David Kitt. How does this provision consider ethical considerations when you are preventing a household? I think this one's already done, right? This is, I think they are talking about the reassessment of the baseline here. And removing access to clean cooking devices. You've answered this, Jessica, right? Okay. So I guess we can move on to the next one, which is from Cristiano. When considering double counting and the requirement to provide a KML file showing the origin of the NRB fuel along with the description of how the area is defined, it is still compulsory the baseline fuel and the project fuels remain the same.
Thanks. So the answer on this one is yes. This would be compulsory also if the baseline fuel and project fuels remain the same. It'd still be required to define or estimate what those geographical boundaries would be of the project fuel source and include that, report that information. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. So next question is from Eva. In the context of LPG cookstove projects, is it always necessary to calculate project emissions from fuel production? If so, when applying tool 15, do we need to always use option B of tool 15, or can we use option A, use a default factor? Thank you.
Great. Yes, you could use a default factor. for related emissions. Yes.
Great. We can move on to the next question from Colin. There are multiple options for quantifying the baseline and project scenario, sums, KPTs. Are there any requirements or limitations from choosing a certain method of observation, or is developer free to choose whichever works best for them? I think Christian's answering it, but you can maybe answer this as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the goal of this methodology was to include options that would apply in the case of any of the baseline and project combinations, and that would capture the emissions impacts across any of those combinations. So I guess the baseline is the one that I would say is a bit more restricted, actually, because unless your baseline survey shows that the kind of exclusive or vast majority of fuel used in your project region is either fuel wood or charcoal, unless you have one of those cases and you can use the default values, then it would be required to undertake the baseline KPT measurement campaign. In the case of the baseline, it will either be the default values or the outcome of the KPT of the baseline KPT campaign. Yeah. And then in the project case, there isn't much of a restriction on which method can be used for which project type. I think the only significant restriction that is included is that the fuel purchase monitoring can only be applied for, let's say, LPG and bioethanol, kind of liquid fuels that are sold in easily measured containers that would provide enough certainty about how much fuel was actually being included or being used in the project. And so that fuel measurement option is restricted to just a few fuel types. And then the measurement options, would be open to everyone. Obviously, there are physical limitations, I think, to continuous measurement of some fuel types. And for that reason, the KPT option is also included. And so I think that there will be some kind of natural, let's say, grouping of certain project characteristics with some of those project measuring alternatives, but there's not restrictions apart from the fuel measuring related restrictions that I already described. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I guess we can move on to the next one, and I'm happy to take this. So Hunain is asking whether there is a process to transition from VMR6 to VM50, and there's any additional information available. So there is a provision under project description deviation processes in our VCS standards. So if you look at section 3.21, there are provisions to allow transition from an earlier version to the newest version of a methodology. And we encourage you to have a look at that section. And if you have any clarifications, requests, or any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. This has been answered previously as well. Okay, thank you. We have a long answer plus a question from Kier. So Jessica, I think he's talking about how to demonstrate, I guess, a zero cost to the end user. So what he's asking is there a process as defined TO, the project developers, how to represent this? And is this only available to the VBs? PDs have an incentive to report report no other funding sources, and VBs only assess adherence to the positive list. Are there independent checks at the country specific level as to the relevance and eligibility of projects for alternative funding? So we're talking about whether what the PD reports is actually comprehensive enough to satisfy positive list requirements.
Sure. So with respect to this question, indeed, in the methodology, the methodology is not directly included requirement on these cross checks, but this type of cross check and questioning is something that it needs to be a standard part of the validation process. And so this type of check would be included in the VCS rules for validation verification of projects. And so, one would expect VBBs to undertake a rigorous validation and so for example, if a project is providing LPG stoves for free, then, VBB would need to ask, well, project developer are you going to be receiving income from, selling LPG to these users? So I think that the expectation is that this concern would be addressed by the validation verification process. And of course, at the Verra certification side, it's something that they would look at when the documents are submitted to Verra as well. Any other thoughts on that one, Pranav, or anyone else from the Verra team?
I think it's part of the on-site interview process. VVB generally interview a host of stakeholders. They will interview community leaders and users and goes in the area, and they would have information about other financial sources in most cases. So they could interview end users and simply ask, were you paying for any services? Have you paid for the Cookstove or whatever? I think that's one source that you can rely on. There are multiple other sources as well. So that's, I guess, one way to do it. So that's done. I guess we can move on to next question, which is from Zama. The overlap with RED Plus projects, for example, potentially resulting in double counting. The guidance for this was not too clear. Are there tangible guidelines for addressing this?
So as I mentioned, this is a concern that is in kind of an information building phase. And so at this time, their question is whether there are RED Plus projects or jurisdictional RED programs whose project boundary overlaps with the expected fuel source area of the project. So again, this would require first, defining that expected fuel source area of the project, which is now required to be reported in, a GIS file. So that will be part of this process. And then it will require checking if there are RED projects or programs in the geographical area whose boundary overlap with that. And so that information is available in the registries, for example, in the Verra registry, and in other registries that host RED projects. And so this will be a step that will need to take place during the project description to define that source area, and then undertake a check if there's any overlap with, if you identify RED projects in that same area, and then report on that.
Great, thanks, Jessica. 96 questions answered so far, so that's great. I don't have any other questions on the list. We still have 2 minutes to go, so I guess we can wait for 2 more minutes. If there are any questions coming in, we can answer them. If not, then there's one from Niharika. Can you help provide a brief on transition from VMR6 to VM50? It would be helpful. If not, to transition in VM50 is a mandatory requirement to continue issuance in previous versions. So we have taken this previously as well, Niharika. Please follow the requirements in section 3.21 of the VCS standard. It talks about how the PD description deviation process needs to be done, and this is part of that. If you want to transition from VMR6 to VM50, you don't need to mandatorily use VM6, but you need to mandatorily transition to VM50 by 2027. I hope that answers your question. So a minute or so to go. Indrapal is asking, generally biomass is sourced by the communities located near forest region from nearby forest, meaning if end users are sourcing the biomass from RED projects, so those Cookstove projects are not eligible, correct? That's a question from him.
So no, at this point, there's no eligibility related to overlap with RED projects. We're in this information seeking phase. So right now, if there were to be found to be overlap with a RED project, that wouldn't mean ineligibility. I would like to point out that the jurisdictional RED standards already require the jurisdictional projects to remove or kind of subtract Cookstove outcomes from their accounting. So that's already, let's say, addressed for jurisdictional type projects. And so we're seeking especially to understand more about what overlap there may be with project-based RED. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. We have a question from Mark, and I guess this will be the last question because we are on time. Has there been progress in terms of timing of projects, crediting period, or is it still approximately 24 months? I'm not sure about this. I'm think he's asking about the review timelines for projects. So not sure. I think our review team is working hard on it and trying to reduce the timelines. They have instituted a risk-based approach, which will hopefully reduce the timelines apart from other approaches as well that they have taken up, which is one of them is like using Project Hub and using DMRV approaches there. So I think that'll help. I'm not sure if I have anything more to add on that. Thank you. So I guess that's all. So thank you everyone for your time. It was a pleasure hosting you. If you have any questions and concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to answer any of your clarification questions. And I hope you found this useful. Thanks again for your time. Goodbye.